The auction house on Station Epsilon 7 smelled like fear and desperation, and Kira could taste it in the recycled air as she stood in her cage and watched the crowd of buyers shuffle past, and her silver hair hung in tangled waves past her shoulders, and her violet eyes tracked every movement with the focus of a predator. And at her feet, two small dragons coiled tight, and their scales shifted between red and gold as they hissed at anyone who came too close. The cage was supposed to be escape-proof, and it had reinforced bars made from starship hull plating and energy dampeners built into the floor to suppress any magic she might try to use, and Kira had tested every weakness over the past 3 days and found none. And so, she waited and conserved her strength and planned. She remembered the night they took her, and the memory burned like acid in her chest, and she had been gathering moonflowers near the edge of her clan's territory when the nets fell from above, and they were made of some synthetic material that conducted electricity. And she woke up in a cargo hold with her hands bound, and her dragons drugged into sleep beside her. That was 12 weeks ago, and since then she had been sold 3 times and escaped twice and injured 6 captors badly enough that they needed medical treatment, and the traders called her wild and dangerous and feral. And they were right, and she would never stop fighting and never stop trying to get home to the forests of Althara. Vex, the auctioneer, was a saurian with dull green scales and nervous eyes, and he stood on the platform adjusting his voice amplifier, while his assistants checked the restraint systems, and Kira watched him and memorized the way he moved, and the way he kept one hand near the stun baton at his belt, and knowledge was a weapon, and she collected every piece she could find. The auction hall filled slowly, and merchants and traders and ship captains filtered in through the main doors, and they came from a dozen different worlds and spoke a dozen different languages, but they all had the same calculating look in their eyes as they examined the merchandise. And Kira was item 73 on the auction list. And she had heard the guards talking, and most of the buyers were here for mining equipment and medical supplies, and she was just a curiosity, and a dangerous one at that. Her dragon stirred, and the smaller one named Ash lifted his head and growled low in his throat, and the larger one named Ember pressed against Kira's leg and offered what comfort she could, and Kira touched each of them gently and felt their heat through her fingertips. And they were young and barely 2 years old, but already fiercely loyal, and they would die for her without hesitation, and she would kill anyone who tried to harm them. A human couple walked past the cage, and the woman pointed and whispered something to her companion, and they both laughed and moved on. And Kira felt rage spike hot in her chest, and she was not entertainment, and she was not a pet. And she was Kira of the Moonwood clan and daughter of the forest and bonded to fire, and she would make them all regret treating her like property. Vex climbed onto the platform and tapped his amplifier in attention buyers. And today we have exotic items from across the sector. And please review your catalog cards, and bidding will begin shortly. The crowd settled into their seats, and Kira counted 47 buyers, and most were alien species she recognized from her captors' ships, and Saurians and Zentari and Krolls and a few others she had no names for. And there were also 5 humans scattered through the crowd, and humans were relatively new to the galactic community. And she had learned, and they were considered weak and naive by most older species, and they took risks other races avoided and operated on the fringes where law was optional. The auction began, and items sold quickly, and mining. Drones went for 8,000 credits, and medical scanners for 12,000, and a cargo hauler for 35,000. And Vex kept up a steady stream of commentary and highlighting features and taking bids, and time crawled, and Kira forced herself to stay calm and to breathe slowly and to wait. Finally, Vex gestured to his assistants and bring out item 73. 2 guards wheeled Kira's cage onto the platform, and the mechanisms squealed and protested, and the crowd leaned forward and interested despite themselves, and Ember and Ash both stood and positioned themselves between Kira and the audience, and their tails lashed and small flames flickered at the corners of their mouths. Vex cleared his throat, and here we have a genuine rarity in an elven female from the forest moon Althara, and approximately 20 cycles of age, and she comes bonded with 2 fire drakes, and both still young but growing fast. And this is a package deal, and all 3 or none. Someone in the front row called out, "And what about the stories?" And I heard she put 2 traders in the medical bay. Vex waved dismissively, and she has spirit, yes, but that makes her valuable and properly handled. She would make an excellent servant or guard. And the drakes alone are worth the price, and fire breathers are rare in captivity. Kira bared her teeth, and her canines were slightly longer than human teeth and sharper, and she spoke for the first time, and her voice carried across the hall, and, "I am not for sale and I'm not property, and release me now or face consequences." Several buyers shifted uncomfortably, and one stood and walked out, and Vex laughed nervously, and as I said, in spirit and bidding, starts at 10,000 credits. Silence filled the room, and no hands rose, and seconds ticked past, and Vex looked annoyed, and 9,000 and still nothing, and 8,000, and a Kroll in the back shook his head and walked toward the exit. The auctioneer was sweating now, and 6,000 credits in anyone, and this is far below market value. Kira felt cold satisfaction, and they were afraid and good, and let them be afraid and let them know she was not broken. And her dragon sensed her emotion, and they raised their heads and released twin streams of flame toward the ceiling, and several buyers jumped, and one knocked over his chair in his haste to move back. Vex looked desperate, and 5,000 and final offer before I pull the lot. The hall stayed quiet, and buyers were already gathering their things and preparing to leave, and no one wanted the trouble, and no one wanted to risk the danger, and Kira allowed herself the smallest smile, and maybe they would have to let her go, and maybe she could escape during transport. Then from the very back of the room a voice spoke, and calm and unhurried, and I will take her. Every head turned, and a human man walked down the center aisle, and he was tall but not unusually so, and he wore practical clothes and a worn jacket and cargo pants and boots that had seen a lot of miles, and his brown hair was a bit too long, and his gray eyes were steady and curious, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in dangerous places. Vex perked up immediately, and sold to the human for 5,000 credits, and please pay at the desk and she is yours. The man nodded and walked to the payment station, and the guards began preparing to transport Kira's cage, and she watched the human and tried to understand what she saw, and he did not look like a slaver, and he did not have the cruel eyes or the calculating expression, and but appearances could deceive, and she had learned that lesson well. As the guards wheeled her toward the exit ramp, she caught the human scent and wood smoke and machine oil and something else, and something that reminded her of open spaces and freedom, and her dragons caught it too, and they stopped hissing and sat down and confused. Kira stored that information away, and another piece of data and another potential weapon, and she would watch this human and learn his weaknesses, and when the moment came, she would take her dragons and disappear into whatever wilderness this station orbited. But for now she waited and patient, and still unready. The human ship was not what Kira expected, and she had seen dozens of vessels during her captivity, and sleek military craft, and massive cargo haulers and luxury yachts that belonged to wealthy traders, and this ship was none of those things, and it was a mid-sized freighter that had seen better days, and the hull was patched in several places, and the paint was faded and scratched, but the engines hummed with steady power, and everything looked functional if not pretty. The guards wheeled her cage up the loading ramp and into a cargo bay that smelled like machine grease and recycled air, and metal and crates were stacked along the walls and secured with cargo nets, and tools hung on pegboards, and everything had a place and a purpose, and the human followed behind and signed something on a datapad and dismissed the guards with a casual wave. When they were alone, he stood in front of the cage and studied Kira with those steady gray eyes, and she stared back and refused to look away first, and her dragons pressed against her legs and watched him carefully. "My name is Jake Cooper," and he said, and his voice was quiet and calm, and I run salvage operations and haul cargo and sometimes help people who need it. Kira said nothing, and just waited. Jake continued, "And I am going to open this cage, and you can attack me if you want, and you can run if you want, or you can listen to what I have to say." He reached for the control panel, and Kira tensed and ready to spring, but Jake moved slowly and deliberately, and he pressed a sequence of buttons, and the cage door swung open with a hiss of hydraulics. Kira remained motionless, and every muscle coiled tight, and this was a trick, and it had to be. And no one simply opened the cage, and no one gave her freedom without wanting something in return. Jake took 3 steps back and held his hands away from his body and palms out, "And I bought you because no one else would," and he said, and I could not leave you there, and I have coordinates for forest moons in 3 nearby systems, and I can take you to any of them, and no charge and no conditions." The words made no sense, and Kira tilted her head and her pointed ears twitched as she processed what he said. And why? And what do you gain? Nothing. And Jake said simply, and except maybe I sleep better knowing I did something decent. This was wrong and all wrong, and slavers wanted obedience, and traders wanted profit, and soldiers wanted weapons, and no one did things for free, and especially not for a wild elf who had caused nothing but trouble. Ash crept forward and nose extended and sniffing toward Jake, and Ember followed and more cautious, and they circled his boots and investigated his scent, and after a long moment they both sat down, and that was their signal, and no threat detected. Kira climbed out of the cage and her legs were stiff from confinement, and she stood to her full height, which brought her eyes level with Jake's shoulder, and she moved like water and silent and controlled and ready to strike if needed. And you expect me to believe you want nothing? I expect you to make your own choice. And Jake said, and there is food in the galley, and a cabin with a door that locks from the inside, and your dragons can stay with you and we can leave whenever you are ready. He turned and walked toward a door at the far end of the cargo bay, and over his shoulder he added, and my quarters are on the upper deck, and navigation is on the bridge, and you are free to explore. But please do not touch the engine controls, and they are temperamental. Then he was gone, and the door slid shut behind him, and Kira stood in the empty cargo bay, with her dragons, and completely confused Ember nudged her hand, and Kira absently scratched behind the dragon's ear ridges, and they trusted Jake. And dragon instincts were rarely wrong, but trust had been beaten out of Kira over the past 3 months, and she had learned that kindness was usually a trap. Still, and she was out of the cage, and the ship felt different from other vessels she had been held on, and there were no guards and no surveillance cameras that she could see, and no restraint equipment, and it was just a working ship that belonged to a man who apparently wanted nothing from her. Kira made a decision, and she would stay alert, and she would find the weapons, and she would learn the ship's layout, and when she discovered Jake's real intentions, she would be ready. She found the galley first, and it was small but clean, and there was a food synthesizer and a cooling unit, and a table with 2 chairs, and on the counter was a covered plate and a note written in simple text, and help yourself. And there is water and juice in the cooler. The food was basic, and protein bars and dried fruit and something that might have been synthetic chicken. And Kira ate carefully, and her stomach had shrunk during captivity, and she could not eat much at once, and her dragons got their own portions, and Jake had left out raw meat for them, and he had researched what fire drakes ate. That detail bothered her, and it suggested planning and care, and those were not traits of someone with cruel intentions. After eating, Kira explored the ship, and it was larger than it looked from outside, and there were 3 levels, and the cargo bay and living quarters and engine rooms on the lower deck, and the main deck had the galley and a common room and 2 small cabins, and the upper deck held the bridge and Jake's quarters, and a workshop. She found the cabin Jake had mentioned, and it was simple, and a bunk, and a small desk, and a storage locker, and a door that did lock from inside. And she tested it 3 times, to be sure, and there was even a window that looked out at the station and stars beyond. Her dragons explored every corner and sniffing and investigating, and they seemed satisfied, and they curled up together on a cushion someone had left in the corner, and Kira sat on the bunk and tried to think. Every instinct screamed this was wrong, and people did not help without reason, and especially not strangers, and especially not wild elves with dragons who had caused trouble and fought back and resisted. But the evidence contradicted her instincts. Jake had opened the cage, and he had offered food and shelter, and he had given her a locked room, and he had asked nothing in return, and he had not even asked her name. Kira lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling, and exhaustion pulled at her, but she fought it, and she needed to stay alert. But her body had other ideas, and weeks of poor sleep and constant stress had taken their toll. She woke to darkness, and confused, and her dragons were pressed against her side and radiating warmth, and the ship was moving, and she could feel the gentle vibration of engines through the hull, and panic spiked, and she jumped up and checked the door, and still locked. There was a soft knock, and Kira's hand went to the knife she had stolen from the galley and hidden in her boot. Jake's voice came through the door, and we are underway, and he said, and I plotted a course toward the Viridian system, and it has 2 forest moons, and we can adjust if you prefer somewhere else, and there is dinner in the galley when you are ready. Footsteps retreated, and Kira stood frozen, and he had not tried to open the door, and he had not demanded anything, and he had simply given information. And left. She waited 10 minutes and then crept to the galley, and the plate on the table held real food and roasted vegetables and something that looked like bread and a bowl of stew that smelled amazing. And another portion sat on the floor for her dragons. Kira ate slowly and savored every bite. And real food was rare in captivity, and she had survived on nutrition paste and protein blocks. Jake appeared in the doorway, and Kira tensed, but he just leaned against the frame and kept his distance and good, and he said, "And I was not sure what elves eat, and I made a guess you cook," and Kira said, and her first words to him since the cargo bay, "Sometimes." And Jake smiled, "And it relaxes me, and better than food synthesizers." Silence stretched, and Kira finished eating and pushed the plate away. "And why are you doing this?" Jake was quiet for a moment, and once someone helped me when they did not have to, and he said, "And it changed my life, and I guess I am trying to pay that forward." That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. Kira studied him and looked for deception and for hidden motives and found only tired honesty, and she did not know what to do with that. "How long to Viridian?" and she asked. 4 days, and Jake said, "and maybe 5 if we hit any gravity wells and you can change your mind any time." Kira nodded and stood, and her dragons followed, and she walked past Jake and back to her cabin, and at the door she paused, "And thank you for the food." "You are welcome," and Jake said. That night Kira locked her door and wedged the chair under the handle and lay awake listening to the ship, but nothing happened, and no one tried to enter, and no alarms sounded, and eventually, despite herself, she slept. The second day in hyperspace, Kira began to explore more freely, and Jake seemed to spend most of his time on the bridge or in the engine room, and he gave her space and never followed or questioned where she went, and her dragons had grown comfortable enough to wander on their own, and she often found them in the cargo bay playing with a rubber ball Jake had given them. She discovered Jake's workshop on the upper deck, and it was filled with salvaged equipment and circuit boards and tools and half-finished repair projects, and everything was organized in a way that suggested someone who understood machines and respected them, and a bookshelf held technical manuals and star charts and a few worn paperbacks with titles like The Old Man and The Sea and Dune. Kira picked up one of the books, and the pages were yellowed and soft from many readings, and she had learned to read common galactic script during her captivity, and guards had left datapads around, and she absorbed information, like a desert absorbed rain. She was still holding the book when Jake appeared in the doorway, and he looked surprised but not angry. "And you can borrow any of them." And he said, "And if you want," Kira set it down quickly, "and I did not mean to invade. Your space, it is not an invasion. If I just told you that you could explore." And Jake walked to a workbench and picked up a small device, and he turned it over in his hands. "And do you read much?" "In my clan we had story keepers," and Kira said, "and they memorized our history and passed it down, and I was training to be one before I was taken. That is a valuable skill." And Jake said, "And memory is its own kind of technology." They stood in comfortable silence, and then Kira asked, "And what are you fixing?" "Proximity sensor," and Jake held it up, "and I pulled it from a derelict last month, and if I can get it working I can sell it at the next port. And salvage work is like that, and you find broken things and make them useful again." "Is that what you are doing with me?" And Kira asked, and her voice sharp, "And fixing something broken?" Jake looked at her directly. "And you are not broken," and he said, "And trapped maybe. And angry definitely. But not broken and broken. Things cannot fight back the way you did." The answer surprised her, and she had expected denial or false comfort and not simple truth. Jake returned to his work, and Kira watched for a moment, and then left, and her mind churning with thoughts she could not organize. That evening she found Jake in the galley cooking again, and the smell made her stomach growl, and he glanced up and smiled, and 20 minutes, and he said, "And I hope you like spicy food." Kira sat at the table, and her dragons settled at her feet. "And why did you buy me?" Jake stirred something in a pan, "And I told you already." "No," and Kira said, "And you told me about paying forward and about someone helping you. But that does not explain why you chose me. And there were other items at the auction and safer purchases." Jake was quiet as he plated the food, and he set a dish in front of her and sat down with his own. "And because everyone else was afraid," and he said, And I figured anyone who scared that many people was either very dangerous or very desperate, and maybe both, and and I have been desperate and I know what it feels like to be treated like cargo. Kira ate slowly, and the food was good and better than good, and what happened to you? Jake took a drink of water, and I was young and stupid and got involved with smugglers, and he said, and they used me to run illegal goods, and when things went wrong they tried to sell me to cover their debts, and a freighter, captain named Helen, bought my contract and then tore it up. And she gave me a job instead and taught me how to really pilot and how to see the difference between taking risks and being reckless. What happened to her? She retired 5 years ago, and Jake smiled and bought a farm on New Terra, and she still sends me messages telling me to be careful. Kira processed this, and so you do this because of her. I do this because it is right. And Jake said, and Helen just showed me that right was possible. They finished eating, and Kira helped clean up without being asked, and Jake looked surprised but said nothing, and afterward they ended up in the common room, and Jake pulled out a holographic star chart and showed her their route. We are here, and he pointed and Viridian is here, but if you want, I can divert to Thalassa instead, and it has 3 forest moons or there is silver pine in the adjacent sector. Kira studied the map, and what if I do not want to go to any of them? Jake looked at her, and then, you tell me what you do want. I want to go home. And Kira said, and to Althara, and to my clan. Jake nodded slowly. And Althara is 8 weeks from here. And he said, and across 3 territorial borders, and 2 of those territories do not allow free passage for elves. And they have treaties with the Traders Guild. And if we got caught, they would seize you again and probably impound my ship. So it is impossible. Jake scratched his jaw, and I did not say impossible, and just difficult. And we would need to avoid the main routes and stick to neutral space and trade some fuel efficiency for safety. And it would take longer, and maybe 10 or 11 weeks. You would do that, and Kira asked, and risk your ship, I would consider it, and Jake said, but I need to know, that is what you really want, and not just what you think you should want. What does that mean? It means you have been through trauma. And Jake said gently, and sometimes when we are hurt, we just want to go back to how things were before. But sometimes we cannot go back. And sometimes we should not, and I am not saying do not go home, and I am just saying make sure it is your choice and not your wounds choosing for you. Kira felt anger flare, and nothing about my wounds. You are right, and Jake said, and I do not. And so, tell me. The anger died as quickly as it came, and Kira found herself talking, and she told him about the night she was captured, and about the markets where she was displayed, and about the guards who treated her like an animal, and about the fear that lived in her chest like a stone. Jake listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, and I am sorry that happened to you, and no one deserves that. Kira felt something crack inside her chest, and something that had been holding tight for months, and she blinked hard, and I do not know if I can go home, and she said quietly, and my clan will have moved, and they follow the seasons, and I do not know if I can find them, and I do not know if they would recognize me now. Then we figure it out together, and Jake said, and you do not have to decide today, and we have time. Over the next 2 days, something shifted, and Kira started spending more time outside her cabin, and she learned how to read the navigation displays, and Jake showed her the basics of hyperspace travel, and she taught him a few words in her language, and the Elvish word for friend was Mila, and the word for home was Nethera, and the word for hope was Lumina. Her dragons grew bolder, and Ash discovered he could breathe fire hot enough to melt plastic, and Ember learned she could use her tail to open doors, and Jake took it all in stride, and he reinforced the cargo bay and gave them more space to practice. On the 4th day, Jake called her to the HFY bridge, and we have a decision to make, and he said, and Viridian is 6 hours away, and do we stop there, or do we keep going? Kira looked at the stars and thought about forest moons and thought about going back to a life that no longer existed, and thought about this strange human who had shown her more kindness than anyone in months. Can I stay here? And she asked. And on your ship, and I could work and earn my passage? Jake smiled, and I was hoping you would ask, and he said, and I could use a crew member and someone who is good with navigation and someone who does not mind adventure. Kira felt something like relief and like possibility. And then I stay. Welcome to the crew. And Jake held out his hand, and Kira looked at it, and then clasped it briefly, and his grip was warm and steady. That night she moved her few possessions into the cabin and made it her own, and she hung a piece of fabric she had found in storage, and made a small altar for her dragons, and for the first time in months, she felt like she had a place. And for the first time in months, she felt like maybe she could build a new home. 3 weeks into their partnership, Jake docked at a trade station called Crossroads, and it was a massive structure that orbited a gas giant and served as neutral territory where ships from all factions could resupply and trade. And Kira had never seen anything like it, and thousands of vessels moved in organized chaos around the docking pylons. And the station itself was a city in space, with markets and bars and repair facilities and everything a traveler might need. Jake secured a docking berth and ran through the shutdown procedures. And we need supplies, and he said, and food and fuel and some replacement parts for the hyperdrive, and you can come along if you want, and or stay with the ship. Kira had not left the Wanderer since boarding, and the thought of walking among crowds made her nervous, but staying behind felt like hiding, and she was tired of hiding. And I will come. Jake nodded. And your dragons should probably stay here. And he said, and stations have rules about exotic animals, and I do not want any trouble. Kira agreed, and she made sure Ash and Ember had food and water, and she sealed them in the cargo bay where they could not accidentally set anything on fire. The station was overwhelming, and beings of every species moved through wide corridors and spoke in dozens of languages, and vendors called out from storefronts, and the air smelled like cooking food and ozone and sweat. And Kira stayed close to Jake, and her hand near the knife hidden in her boot. They stopped at a supply depot first, and Jake ordered fuel cells and protein packs and water filtration cartridges. And the clerk barely looked up as he processed the transaction, and Kira watched everything and memorized exits and assessed threats, and old habits died hard. At a parts shop, Jake haggled with a Zentari merchant over hyperdrive components, and Kira wandered to a nearby stall that sold fabrics and trinkets, and she touched a length of blue cloth that reminded her of the sky over. Althera and the vendor smiled. And beautiful, yes, and only 20 credits. Kira had no credits, and she started to pull her hand back. But Jake appeared beside her, and we will take 2 meters, and he said, and he paid, and handed her the fabric. And for your cabin, and he said, and make it feel like home. Kira folded the cloth carefully and thank you. They continued through the market and stopped at a food vendor where Jake bought something called dumplings, and they sat on a bench near a viewport that looked out at the stars and ate. And Kira had never tried dumplings before, and they were hot and savory and delicious. This is good. And she said Jake grinned, and best food in 3 sectors. And he said, and I always stop here when I pass through. As they ate, Kira noticed a group of traders watching them from across the corridor, and there were 4 of them and all saurian, and their eyes lingered on her with recognition, and she tensed. Jake followed her gaze, and friends of yours, No and Kira, said, but they look like traders from the auction house network. Jake stood in casually, and we should head back. They walked toward the docking area, and Kira felt the traders following, and she could hear their footsteps and their muttered conversation, and Jake noticed too, and his hand moved to something at his belt, and a stun weapon probably. The corridor narrowed as they entered the docking section, and fewer people around, and the footsteps behind them quickened, and Jake turned suddenly and, "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The lead trader stepped forward, and he was bigger than the others and had a scar across his snout, and that elf belongs to the Traders Guild, and he said, and she was reported stolen from auction house Epsilon. She was purchased, legally, and Jake said, in his voice calm but hard, and I have the transaction records. The trader sneered, and purchase was made under false pretenses, and the item was meant for guild redistribution, and you will return her now or face penalties. Kira felt rage ignite an item, and she hissed, and I am not an item. The trader ignored her and focused on Jake, and this does not concern you, human, and walk away, and we will forget this happened. Jake crossed his arms, and I am not going anywhere. And neither is she, and if the guild has a problem, they can file a formal complaint. The trader reached for Kira, and she moved without thinking, and her knife was in her hand, and the blade pressed against his throat before he could blink, and her eyes blazed violet and touch me and die. The trader froze, and his companions reached for weapons, but Jake had his stunner out and pointed at them, and everyone stops, and Jake said, or this gets messy. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved, and then station security rounded the corner, and weapons drawn, and what is happening here? The lead security officer was human, and a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, and her badge read, Commander Lopez. The trader immediately changed his tone, and these people stole guild property, and he said, and we were attempting to recover it. Jake kept his stunner steady, and I purchased her legally at auction, and he said, and I can provide documentation, and these traders tried to seize her. By force, Lopez looked at Kira and still holding the knife to the trader's throat and lower the weapon. Kira hesitated and then stepped back, and the knife disappeared into her boot faster than anyone could follow. Lopez addressed the traders. And do you have proof of theft? The trader sputtered. And the guild regulations clearly state I did not ask about regulations. And Lopez said, and I asked about proof. And show me documentation that this purchase was illegal. The trader had no answer, and Lopez sighed, and I thought so. And this is neutral territory, and guild rules do not apply here. And if you have a legitimate complaint, file it through proper channels, and otherwise clear out before I charge you with assault and attempted kidnapping. The traders retreated and muttering threats and promises that the guild would not forget this, and when they were gone, Lopez holstered her weapon, and you too, and she said, and my office, and now they followed her to a small security station, and Lopez dropped into a chair behind a cluttered desk and let me see your documentation. Jake pulled up the purchase records on his datapad, and Lopez reviewed them carefully and finally nodded. And this looks legitimate. And she said, but the traders. Guild is going to be a problem, and they do not like losing merchandise, and especially not to independents. What should we do? And Jake asked, get out of here as fast as you can, and Lopez said, and file your flight plan for somewhere the guild has no jurisdiction, and maybe the frontier sectors or independent systems, and watch your back. She looked at Kira, and you chose to stay with him. Yes. And Kira said, good choice, and Lopez said, and most humans are decent, and despite what other species think, and she stood and now get moving before those traders come back with reinforcements. They returned to the Wanderer quickly, and Jake ran through pre-flight checks at double speed, and Kira helped, and her hands steady despite the adrenaline, still coursing through her system, and her dragons sensed the urgency, and paced the cargo bay and ready for action. As the ship pulled away from the station, Jake set course for the frontier and somewhere far from guild territory, and Kira watched. Crossroads shrink in the viewport, and another place left behind, and another threat escaped. Are you okay? And Jake asked. Kira considered the question, and yes, and she said, and I am tired of running, but I am okay. We will find somewhere safe, and Jake promised, and somewhere we can work without looking over our shoulders. That night Kira could not sleep, and she found Jake on the bridge, and he was reviewing star charts and planning their route. Thank you. And she said, and for not giving me back to them. Jake looked at her, and I told you already, and he said, and I do not own you, and no one does, and those traders had no right to you. Most people would not have risked it. I am not most people. No. And Kira said softly, and you are not. They sat in silence and watched the stars stream past, and after a while Kira asked, and where are we going? Jake pointed to a cluster on the chart and the Haven system, and he said, and it is independent, and no guild presence and no major government control, and people go there when they want to disappear or start over. Kira studied the map, and it was far from Althara and far from everything she had known. But maybe far was good, and maybe starting over was what she needed. The Wanderer jumped to hyperspace and carrying them toward an uncertain future, but for the first time Kira felt like maybe uncertain was better than trapped, and maybe unknown was better than afraid, and maybe with Jake and her dragons she could find something she had lost months ago. Maybe she could find herself again. The Haven system was everything Jake promised and more, and it sat at the edge of mapped space where 3 territories met, and no single government claimed authority, and the main station was called Freeport, and it operated under simple rules, and no violence in common areas, and no questions about your past, and everyone paid their docking fees, and beyond that you were on your own. Jake guided the Wanderer into dock with practiced ease, and Kira watched through the viewport as hundreds of ships moved in organized patterns, and she saw vessels she recognized, and freighters and scouts and personal yachts, and also ships she had never seen before, and strange designs from distant worlds and everything. Here was welcome, as long as you followed the rules. We can stay as long as we need, and Jake said, and there are repair facilities and good markets and work opportunities, if we want them. Kira had been thinking about work and about earning her place, and I want to learn more, and she said, and about piloting and about navigation and about everything, you know. Jake smiled, and then we start today. Over the following weeks, Kira threw herself into learning, and Jake was a patient teacher, and he showed her how to read instrument panels and how to calculate jump coordinates and how to manage power distribution during flight. And she absorbed everything, like dry earth absorbed rain, and her mind was quick, and she had spent her life learning from story keepers, and this was just another kind of knowledge. Her dragons grew rapidly, and Ash was now the size of a large dog, and Ember slightly bigger, and they had learned to control their fire, and could breathe precise streams, or wide fans depending on need. And Jake built them a proper space in the cargo bay with heat-resistant walls and a vent system that handled the smoke. One morning, Jake brought news, and there is a salvage contract available, and he said, and a derelict transport ship about 3 days from here, and the company wants us to recover the navigation core and some other components, and it pays well. Kira straightened and interested, and can I come? That is why I am telling you, and Jake said, and you are crew, and this is what we do. They departed that afternoon, and the journey to the derelict was quiet, and Jake used the time to teach Kira more about reading sensor data and identifying ship signatures, and she proved to have a natural talent for pattern recognition, and she could spot anomalies in the data that Jake sometimes missed. The derelict floated in the dark, and a massive transport vessel that had lost power and been abandoned, and its hull was intact, but all the lights were dead, and Jake maneuvered the Wanderer alongside and matched velocity, and then they suited up and prepared to board. This was Kira's first time in a pressure suit, and Jake checked her seals twice and make sure your tether stays attached. And he said, and stay close, and if anything feels wrong, we leave. Immediately they crossed into the derelict through an airlock that Jake manually cranked open, and inside was darkness, and the beams from their helmet lights cut through the void and revealed corridors lined with frost and floating debris, and everything was silent and still and dead. Jake led the way, and his movements confident and economical, and Kira followed, and her senses heightened, and she could feel the wrongness of this place. And ships were meant to hum with life, and this one was empty. They found the bridge, and Jake located the navigation core and began the extraction, while Kira kept watch, and her light swept across the frozen consoles and the empty chairs, and she wondered what had happened here, and why the crew had abandoned ship. Jake finished the extraction and got it, and he said, and there are some other components nearby that we can grab, and should only take another hour. They moved through the ship and collecting circuit boards and power couplings and anything that had value. And Kira noticed something, and a pattern in how things were scattered, and it looked deliberate and not random. Jake, and she said, and I think someone else has been here. Jake stopped, and when recently, and Kira pointed to marks on the wall, and those are fresh and the frost has not reformed. They moved more carefully after that, and Jake kept one hand near the cutting torch at his belt, and Kira wished she had brought her knife, and but weapons and pressure suits did not mix well. They found the salvagers in the cargo bay and 3 figures in mismatched suits, and they were cutting into a sealed container with industrial tools, and they turned when Jake and Kira's lights hit them, and for a moment no one moved. Then the largest salvager activated his comm, and this site is claimed, and move along. Jake kept his voice calm, and we have a legal contract from the transport company, and you are stealing. The salvager laughed, and a harsh sound over the radio, and legal means nothing out here, and take your contract and leave. Jake started to respond, but Kira noticed something, and the salvagers were positioned wrong, and they had surrounded the container, and not Jake and Kira, and whatever was inside must be valuable, and more valuable than anything else on the ship. She made a decision and activated her comm and Ash and Ember, and she said in her language, and we need you. The salvagers looked confused, and what did she say? Jake caught on immediately, and he smiled. And she called our security. The cargo bay had an external airlock, and Jake had taught Kira how to use the ship's remote systems, and she triggered the door from her suit controls, and it opened, and her dragons shot through like missiles. and their scales reflecting the helmet lights and their eyes glowing in the darkness. In zero gravity, the dragons moved like they were born for it, and they had been practicing in the cargo bay. And Ash breathed a stream of fire that lit up the entire bay, and Ember grabbed one salvager's suit in her claws and shook him like a toy. The salvagers panicked and scrambled for the exit, and one managed to grab the container, but Ash cut him off and breathed another flame burst, and the salvager dropped the container and fled. In less than a minute, the bay was empty except for Jake and Kira, and two very proud dragons. Jake checked the container and whistled, and medical supplies, and he said, "And expensive stuff. And the transport company will pay extra for this." They loaded everything into the Wanderer and returned to Freeport, and the transport company was delighted, and they paid triple the original contract, and Jake split the bonus with Kira without being asked. That night, they celebrated, and Jake bought real food instead of synthesized, and they ate in the common room. And Kira felt something unfamiliar, and it took her a moment to recognize it, and contentment. "You did well today," and Jake said, "and you thought fast and used every resource we had. I had a good teacher," and Kira said over the next 2 months they took more jobs and salvage contracts and cargo runs and even a few passenger transports, and Kira learned fast, and soon she was handling navigation on her own and managing cargo logistics and negotiating with clients, and Jake trusted her completely. And that trust felt better than any payment. Her dragons became famous at Freeport, and the elf with fire drakes who worked salvage, and people started seeking them out specifically, and Jake Cooper and his crew were reliable and capable and not afraid of difficult jobs. One evening, Jake called her to the bridge, and "There is something I want to show you," and he pulled up a star chart, and "This is," Althera Kira felt her chest tighten. "And why are you showing me this? Because you should know." And Jake said, "And I plotted a route, and it would take 9 weeks, and I could do it." "And if you want to go home?" Kira looked at the distant star and thought about her clan and about the forest where she had grown up and about the life she had lost, and then she looked around the bridge and at the ship that had become home, and at the human who had given her freedom and choice and purpose. "I am home," and she said quietly. Jake nodded, and like he understood, and like he had hoped she would say that, and "Okay," and he closed the chart, "And if you ever change your mind, I know." And Kira said, "And thank you." That night she went to her cabin and hung the blue fabric Jake had bought her, and she arranged her few possessions and made space for her dragons, and she thought about everything that had happened since the auction house. She had been property, and then she had been free, and then she had been crew, and somewhere in that journey she had stopped being a captive and started being herself again. Her door was unlocked, and she realized, and she had not locked it in weeks, and she did not need to anymore. Jake had asked nothing from her except that she choose her own path, and in doing so he had given her everything, and safety and purpose and friendship and trust. The next morning Kira found Jake in the workshop, "And I want to learn to pilot." And she said, "And really pilot. And not just navigation." Jake looked up and grinned, and then let's get started. They spent the day on the bridge, and Jake in the co-pilot seat while Kira took the controls, and at first she was cautious and afraid of making mistakes. But Jake was patient and encouraging, and by evening she was executing simple maneuvers and docking procedures. Over the following months, Kira became a true pilot, and Jake taught her everything he knew, and emergency procedures and combat flying, and how to read a ship's personality through the way it handled. And the Wanderer had quirks and a tendency to pull left during atmospheric entry, and a hyperdrive that needed careful management. But she was solid and reliable, and Kira learned to love every difficult, temperamental part of her. 1 year after the auction house, Jake and Kira sat in the common room and reviewed their accounts, and they had saved enough to upgrade several ship systems, and maybe even expand their operation. We could get a second